So I'll just start. I'm Stefan from the University of Bamberg, and I'm also the chair of this session, apart from this first one, so I hope that you will cut me off after 15 minutes. And I will talk about the relationship of language change and language evolution, which is an issue that actually Martin Haspelmath has raised in a blog post a couple of years ago. And his line of reasoning or his argument is basically that there has been a kind of confusion between these terms, language change and language evolution. And he basically says that until the mid-1990s, the term language evolution only applied to the emergence of language as a human-specific trait. But around the time when language evolution, in the sense of language origins, became fashionable again as a scientific subdiscipline of linguistics, other people started to use it as well. For example, in the context of grammaticalization research, where Bybee and colleagues published a book called The Evolution of Grammar, which is obviously more about grammaticalization on a historical time scale than about the origins of language. He argues that the main reason for this is that the term evolution, as he puts it, seems sexier and more fashionable than language change. And so he basically says it came as a real surprise to him that they called it evolution, and he attributes this to the greedy publishers. And if we look at a couple of recent papers, I've just brought one example, there seems to be some confusion potential indeed. So for example, here's a paper by Patrick Monaghan and Sean Roberts talking about borrowings of words, which seems to be a topic that traditionally belongs more to language change, to language evolution, but it actually has language evolution in the topic. And there are some other examples that I will not mention now for reasons of time. The discussion actually continued on Twitter when I co-organized a session on language evolution at last year's, 2 years ago, with the SLE conference, where Martin Haspelmath again asked, what is language evolution actually, what does it refer to? And there was quite a lengthy discussion about this topic, which is still, which you can still look up on Twitter. And he concludes that language evolution basically has three meanings now. It refers to the origin of language, language change studied from basically the perspective of variation and selection, as for example in Bill Croft's evolutionary approach to language change, and then language change at a global level, for example in the paper on potential relationships between climate and language by Caleb Everett and colleagues. And he concludes that this doesn't even include grammaticalization, which would be yet another sense of grammaticalization. So is he right? Is there just a big Babylonian confusion of terms, basically, that are mindlessly used the wrong way? Or is there more to it? Well, as you might expect, what I want to convince you now is that, well, Haspelmath is right, and there's nothing more to it. And that's all I have to say. No, of course not. Instead, I want to argue that there is more to it, and what I'm going to argue for in this talk is that the term evolution has indeed come to be used in a broader sense, but not because, or not just because it's so fashionable, but for other reasons that have to do with major developments in language evolution and in historical linguistics. And more specifically, I want to suggest that historical linguistics and language evolution research have started to converge partially on similar research questions, and also, again, partly on a shared methodological toolkit. And the use of the term evolution in both contexts arguably reflects this convergence. So I first want to give you a very, very brief overview of, well, the relationship of historical linguistics and language evolution research, and then go back to this matter of terminology and the question of how evolution is actually used by different people. Okay, let's first take a look at what historical linguistics textbooks say about language evolution. Here is a lengthy quote by Joseph Campbell from his recent edition of the famous historical linguistics book, where he says that language evolution research is not generally considered to be a topic of historical linguistics, and he also says that many hypotheses abound, but it's very difficult to gain footing in this area. So basically saying that it's kind of a speculative affair still. A very similar statement can actually be found in the Handbook of Historical Linguistics by Brian Joseph and Richard Chander, who say that it's not obvious how the methodologies of historical linguistics can contribute anything to illuminate the issue of language evolution research. By contrast, other scholars like Bybee, for example, or also Heine and Kuteva, argue that the same mechanisms that are at work in the evolution of language on a historical timescale can also be assumed to drive the ultimate emergence of language, put quite concisely in this quote by Bybee, but as I said, similar arguments have been made elsewhere. Conversely, it has been stated that the field of language evolution research usually considers historical linguistics as out of its scope. For example, there's a conference report on the Evolang in, I think, Vienna, where the authors state that historical linguistics has been consistently blocked by Evolang, which is not really a statement that I would share in this way, but indeed there have been some tensions, I guess, or well, there has been the open question of whether it really belongs to the domain of evolutionary linguistics or not. So one obvious issue then is the scope of investigation of both approaches, historical linguistics and language evolution research. And one obvious way to approach this distinction is, of course, along the lines of biology and culture, where we could say that language evolution is traditionally concerned with language origins, which entails a certain focus on the biological predispositions for language, either in the sense of some faculty of language or some domain general predispositions for language. I will talk more about that tomorrow together with Michael Bleier. And on the other hand, cultural evolution, which would be more the focus of traditional historical linguistics. As we all know, however, this is not how we usually think about language or language change, language evolution, at least most of us. We are aware that we can't really draw a neat distinction between biology and culture, especially if we take a complex adaptive systems view, as an increasing number of researchers do. And interestingly, this implicit or explicit turn towards a complex adaptive systems approach can be witnessed in various linguistic paradigms. For example, I would argue that especially in the different paradigms under the umbrella of cognitive linguistics, they have undergone a very similar development, maybe with some temporal delays, in the sense that they at first basically focused on language as a cognitive phenomenon, basically assuming still an idealized speaker-hearer, a little bit like in the generative tradition, but different. And then they realized, okay, maybe there's more to it because we use language for communication, obviously, and communication, at least in the prototypical sense, involves more than one person. And so we also have to take social networks and things into account. And this was where approaches like cognitive social linguistics and so on came into play. But especially recently, people have also started to discover, okay, if there are different speakers, there should also be different grammars. And so the focus has again shifted to the question of how individual grammars look like and which individual differences we can see between individuals' linguistic knowledge. And this, of course, leads us back to this complex adaptive systems approach, which in essence says that grammars on a population levels are abstractions over individual grammars. Now, in their seminal paper about complex adaptive systems, Beckner and colleagues basically frame this approach mainly in terms of cultural evolution without saying too much about biological evolution. Other people working in the CIS framework do that. But there's also work that explicitly combines historical linguistics with ideas from biological evolution. And these works can roughly be grouped into categories. On the one hand, historical linguistic studies that draw inspiration from evolutionary biology in their theoretical modeling of language, like language change, like, for example, Croft's approach. And on the other hand, works that apply methods from fields such as evolutionary biology to historical linguistic data. Remy van Driep's work being a case in point. And they often also discuss implications for language origins. So there has been considerable convergence between the fields of language evolution research and historical linguistics in the last 20 years or so. And this can probably partly be attributed to some what I would like to call tectonic shifts that we have witnessed not just in linguistics, but also in other disciplines across the humanities and sciences. And I will focus on two that are interrelated. First of all, the empirical turn, and then again, as I already mentioned, the rise of complex adaptive systems approaches. The empirical turn is on the one hand so obvious that we don't really have to talk about it, because it's obvious that the availability of large amounts of language data and an increasing amount of computational power have made it possible to apply quantitative methods in a way that would not have been possible just a few decades ago. Both in historical linguistics and in language evolution research, there's a general trend towards the application of more sophisticated statistical methods to increasingly large data sets. I've brought as one example a big host of linguistic data compiled by Bodo Winter and colleagues, the language goldmine, and as a second example for correlational studies, a review paper by Ladd and colleagues where they review a lot of large-scale correlational studies that have become important in recent years. From a philosophy of science perspective, however, it's quite interesting that currently something else is happening, especially in the wake of the so-called replication crisis, because there's been a lot of self-reflection in different disciplines about the way we do science. And we've come to recognize that it's not enough to play around with big data, but that we actually need well-motivated hypotheses. And one symptom for this is the current hype, basically, around so-called causal graphs, including the so-called directed acyclic graphs, or DAG for short, that have become very popular. And I've brought one example here, which basically is a way of formalizing and visualizing causal relations between different variables. So here you can see them in action from one paper by Ladd and colleagues, and the most recent variant of this is, of course, the SHIELD database by Shaw Roberts, which basically collects huge amounts of these graphs from many, many different papers. Okay, what does this tell us now about the initial question about the relationship between evolution and change, after saying so much about historical linguistics and evolutionary linguistics? Let's take a quick look about how proponents from these approaches actually use the term evolution. And interestingly, the relation between these terms evolution and change is more reflected in the literature on language evolution, where, for example, Mufwene says I'm tempted to say in a recent paper, but my students tell me that 2001 is not so recent because they were not born by then. So Mufwene, for example, says, by evolution, I mean no more than the long-term changes undergone by a language or language variety over a period of time. So again, he brings in this broader perspective, also mentioned by Haskelmatt in the initial blog post. And Sverker Johansson, in his book about different approaches to language evolution, says that the diachronic processes of language change are basically a form of language evolution. And interestingly, Christiansen and Shater have a chapter called Language Evolution as Linguistic Change. So they basically see language evolution as an instance of linguistic change, and they go even further in stating that the distinction between language change and evolution is ultimately an artificial one. Although it seems questionable that this distinction was introduced actively and deliberately, as they claim, because after all, science and scientific terminology are subject to cultural evolution as well. But similar to the own argument that I've tried to make, they come to the conclusion that common threads are emerging, which create the basis for a radically different synthesis in the study of language. So that we could basically say that these tendencies that I've tried to outline towards holistic approaches towards language, cognition, and culture are reflected in the increasing use of the term evolution, which is basically used as an index in this Silversteinian sense to indicate a kind of alignment with these frameworks that emphasize these holistic approaches that are also reflected in the increasing investigation of phenomena on a larger scale, like cultural evolution, for example. And which entail a multifactorial, data-based, but usually hypothesis-driven approach. Okay, so to sum up, what I wanted to convince you of is that we have witnessed a trend towards holistic approaches to language and communication. One could also say from a kind of splitting to lumping in a way, and in a complex systems approach, we basically have the prototype of lumping in the sense of that everything is connected, and so we can see this convergence between different approaches, which is reflected also in terminology. And if you want to hear more about this, come to Michael's and my paper, which we'll present tomorrow, probably around 12:20. As we all know, it's a little bit uncertain regarding the timing, but apart from that, I hope that I could convince you of some preliminary points. The rest is to follow tomorrow. Thank you.